As I was saying, this evening arose really from a dinner that Corinne and I shared at the Tate in London, where I am a trustee, and we discovered that we shared a lot of interests in modern art, even perhaps including conceptual art, which Professor von Weizsäcker has dismissed as a movement in a stroke of the pen. We also discovered that we had an interest in public policy issues, and so one thing led to another, and she invited me to come and speak here this evening. Of course, it looked as if it wasn't going to be possible to reach you, but Corinne is able to dismiss a cloud of ash with a wave of her hand. And so this morning, the airport was opened again. I have to say, I'm going to be rather more practical. And as Professor von Weizsäcker said, I am really a public policy practitioner masquerading as an academic. And also, of course, I'm British, so rather practical and pragmatic, and I will not be engaging in high-flown thoughts about what Europe really is. I felt, when I heard Professor von Weizsäcker start and say that he was going to deal with 3 issues, this brought back horrible memories of the time when I was partly educated in France, where every French presentation is an exposé en 3 parties. This is obligatory in French lycées or French universities, and I regard the fact that Germans are engaging in this as a very bad sign that the Franco-German alliance is still as strong as ever. Now, I have one advantage in my presentation this evening, which is that it is extremely topical, and I have one disadvantage, which is that it is extremely topical. And as I was looking through this afternoon what I was planning to say, the text of my lecture was finished last Thursday, and of course large chunks of it are in some ways out of date. So I have tried to adapt to some degree. I did think of talking instead about the exotic British attempts to form a government, which have still not produced any useful outcome, or about Bayern München's chances in the Champions League final, very small in my view. But I decided that these were more controversial topics, and let's stick to something simple and easy like the future of the euro. So I decided to sort of retain my framework, and I will try to point out where things have changed as a result of the weekend and where things have not. Now, my title this evening is taken from a statement by Joaquin Almunia, who was then Commissioner for European Economic and Monetary Affairs in October of 2008 at a conference in Washington to celebrate the euro's 10th birthday. And he said then, the 10th anniversary of the introduction of the euro is characterized by deep crisis. The European Commission's argument that we need to do more work on the single currency is now evident. EMU is not finished, it is unfinished business. And the truth of that has been amply demonstrated in the last few weeks as the Greek debt crisis has played out. And this has not, and how can I say this delicately, this has not been Europe's finest hour. Although the nature of the problem was well understood and the market risks were identified well ahead, it has proved extraordinarily difficult to reach any agreement which would be useful to the Greeks or others. And what has been agreed was agreed at 5 minutes to midnight in time-honored European fashion. There's been much criticism as a result of Greek governments, both past and present, of German politicians, of the leadership of the European Central Bank, and indeed of the lack of leadership in the European Union as a whole. And I have to tell you that the episode has generated a lot of adverse publicity for Europe around the world. In the last month, as it happens, I've been to China, Hong Kong, India, Singapore, Brunei, and the US, and everywhere I've been asked with some puzzlement about why the nettle wasn't being grasped. And the episode has been used to demonstrate that, once again, Europe can't solve its own problems. The attitude was well summarized in a headline in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago. As Greek drama plays out, where is Europe? They said. Now, it's not my aim this evening to offer a blow-by-blow analysis of the crisis or take part in the blame game in relation to individuals. All of the people involved are well qualified for and indeed well rehearsed in the parts they play. They've all been attempting to resolve the problem and to succeed in a way which maintains the integrity of the monetary union. And the fact that they found it so difficult to do so powerfully suggests to me that there is a flaw in the structures within which they operate. It seems obvious, therefore, that if the Greek crisis is not to spread to the other countries which we unflatteringly call the pigs, we need to analyze these structural flaws quite carefully. I've chosen a very appealing picture of pigs, as you know. I'm not trying to denigrate the pigs in any way. But we need, if we're going to solve the problems of Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain, we need to analyze these structural flaws quite carefully and seek a solution for them. And I think this is more useful than trying to blame the rating agencies, which, in this case, I believe, have simply been, possibly rather late, crystallizing a general view of the unsustainability of Greek finances without some external intervention. And it's rather depressing that European politicians seem to think that this attack on the rating agencies is a kind of substitute for policy. But I hear you ask yourselves internally, is it appropriate at all for an Englishman to comment on these matters? Because we are on the sidelines and likely to remain so. Indeed, last week, The Economist, in an amusing redrawing of the map of Europe, positioned us alongside Portugal, disappearing off into the mid-Atlantic. I think there's something to be said for this. We get better weather as a result, but they were pointing out that as far as the UK was concerned, we were a very high deficit country and somehow at the margins of Europe. Well, there's some truth in this, and certainly we can say that there is little or no chance of the UK seeking to become a member of the euro area in the foreseeable future. Indeed, I'm as certain as I can be that we will not be members in my lifetime, and I am feeling quite well. Indeed, our membership has become even less likely as a result of what's been happening in recent weeks. Our Liberal Democrat Party was in favour of euro membership until during the election campaign they were challenged about Greece, and suddenly they abandoned that policy commitment which they'd had for 2 decades. I am, in fact, one of the very few people in the UK who has been prepared to say in public that he is in favour of euro membership, which in London is the love that dare not speak its name. But even I have begun to entertain some doubts in the light of recent events. But I assure you I speak as a commentator who wishes this project to succeed. I also speak against the background of some work I've been doing over the last couple of years on central banking, and particularly on the construction of the European system of central banks, which has just been published in a book called Banking on the Future. And the question, though, that I've set myself really for this evening is, can EMU survive without structural changes? And if not, what should those changes be? And I might adapt that slightly to ask whether what was agreed over the weekend is enough to qualify as structural changes of the sort required. Now, taking a step back first, we should recall that there are those who have always maintained that the monetary union was ill-designed. One disinterested observer said at the outset, "I believe that the single currency is bound to fail, economically, politically, and indeed socially, although the timing, occasion, and full consequences are all necessarily unclear." That was Margaret Thatcher. But we might also recall that in 1991, Helmut Kohl said, "It can't be repeated often enough, political union is the indispensable counterpart to economic and monetary union. Recent history, and not just that of Germany, teaches us that the idea of sustaining economic and monetary union over time without political union is a fallacy." Now, it's striking that many commentators on recent events have tended to see in them confirmation of positions they have long held. So we've heard many commentators in the UK produce various versions of "I told you so," explaining the Greek problem was a crisis waiting to happen and that a one-size-fits-all monetary policy could never possibly work for such a diverse economic area. This, I think, is called Schadenfreude, though we do not have a word for such an unpleasant emotion in English. Just as the French have no word for fair play, as you know. There has been much self-congratulation about our decision to stay outside. Indeed, in the last days of the election campaign, Gordon Brown attempted to turn this into a strong point in his favour, that he was the man who kept us out of the euro. But it's not only British commentators, who might be perhaps ignored for the time being, who have found their prejudices confirmed. The French have for some time argued that there needs to be an economic government in Europe as a counterweight to the European Monetary Authority of the ECB, an argument which has typically not held much appeal for German leaders. Dominic Strauss-Kahn has once again recently said, "I know of no country that has a currency, but with no finance minister in charge of that currency. We have a very strong central bank, but in front of that, no real person in charge of the economy. It's very difficult to make decisions without a centralized power." So that's the French view. A more typical German view, and I recognize there hasn't just been one German view in this crisis, came from Ottmar Issing, whom Corinne has already quoted this evening. His call has been for a return to the rules, which were an essential element in the construction of EMU at the outset. As Ottmar said, lax monitoring and compromises when it comes to observing implementation of rules have to stop. EMU is a club of states with firm rules accepted by entrants. These rules must not be changed ex post. And these firm observations appeared in the Financial Times under the headline, "Europe cannot afford to rescue Greece." Now, we know, of course, that many Germans, and indeed others around Europe, believe that the rules were bent at the outset to admit Greece and indeed other countries like Italy and Belgium. But that's fine, but we have to take things as they are. And indeed, I could recall that the Stability and Growth Pact was abandoned when Germany failed to meet its strict conditions, and that on its 2009 performance, Germany would not qualify for entry to Economic and Monetary Union itself. But I'm in Germany, so I won't make those points at all. So the crisis has been an opportunity for the restatement of long-held views. But it's also been a moment when some interesting rethinking has been underway in an attempt to identify ways in which the construction of the monetary union might be made robust. And in an attempt to make these arguments easier to follow, I suggest there are 6 different areas on which we might focus our attention. So my presentation will be precisely twice as good as Professor von Weizsäcker's, because I have 6 areas. Some of them are relatively uncontroversial and we could deal with them quite briefly, though that doesn't necessarily mean that they are easy. Others take us into far more disputed territory. And I begin with fiscal discipline. There is little doubt that tighter fiscal discipline, there we are, within the Eurozone, and more effective monitoring of fiscal positions is going to be needed in future at the very minimum. We can't possibly imagine a repeat of the experience of the last few years, during which Greece reported deficits to the European Commission, which turned out to be significantly understated. Here's what the Greeks notified. The blue lines are what the Greeks notified to the Commission during the course of the year in question, and the red line was what the deficit turned out to be. It is clear that the European Commission needs much stronger auditing powers, as indeed it has itself proposed. The Commission proposal envisages in-depth visits to member states by Eurostat, which go beyond the mere checking of compliance with statistical standards. And Eurostat would have access to the raw data, which has not been the case in the past. It has simply taken what has emerged from the finance ministry in question. This, I think, is probably now going to happen. Indeed, it's almost uncontroversial, although it has been strongly resisted by countries in the past. But of course, just monitoring will not be particularly effective unless there is a renewed commitment to some form of new stability and growth pact. As we know, that pact was sidelined in 2003, and it needs to be reinstated in some form. Now, of course, the terms of the old pact are extremely difficult for countries to meet at present. And as I pointed out, even Germany doesn't do so. We remain in a post-crisis situation, so that's not unexpected. But the question of how quickly countries should return to the terms of the pact, and indeed whether those terms need to be revised in the light of experience, is still an open one. There is understandable nervousness about fiscal tightening at a time when the recovery is hardly assured in many places. And the numbers involved in terms of fiscal consolidation needed are really very large in some countries, and the UK is in as serious a position as anyone. And this is the fiscal tightening as a percentage of GDP needed in the next decade to get to a 60% of GDP public debt ratio, the ratio that Professor von Weizsäcker referred to a moment ago. And you can see that the numbers are huge in the case of the UK, where it's about a 13% fiscal tightening is required in order to get there. So everybody has got a lot of nervousness about imposing a pact now, but tightening is now unavoidable where debt is unaffordable, as in Greece. So there is a big task ahead here for Europe's finance ministers, and one which I would say they have not resolved over the weekend. Because what we now have is the outline of a series of specific crisis packages with conditionality attached, notably for Greece, but we do not have even the beginnings of a new medium to long-term stability and growth pact, which people can gradually converge on. But even if you could agree such a thing, will it be enough just to reinstate the pact? Well, Ottmar Issing thinks so. He says that the Stability and Growth Pact contains the rules that are necessary for monetary union to function. There is no need for coordination of macroeconomic policy to go any further than this. But others do disagree and think there are more fundamental problems to address. And the most important one, I think, is competitiveness, which arguably was not dealt with at all over the weekend, although it could be said that this is what the problem is all about. One remarkable and perhaps surprising feature of the evolution of the euro area over its first decade has been the changes in real exchange rates and competitiveness within it. Germany, which may possibly have joined at an overvalued exchange rate, certainly that was widely argued at the time, has improved its relative unit labour costs year on year. Italy, Spain and Portugal have done the reverse, failing to control domestic costs or failing to match the German productivity performance. With hindsight, it seems that they regarded euro membership as an excuse no longer to worry about external competitiveness. And these changes have produced very predictable consequences in different relative export performance country by country. This is, I think, a rather interesting chart produced from a Bruegel policy brief just a month or so ago. What it's got is, on the vertical axis, the change in exchange rate relative to the euro area. That is adjusting for different unit labour cost performance. And then on the horizontal axis, it has export growth defined as the excess over the euro area average. So if you were at the middle of the square, you would have unit labour costs which had moved in the European average way, and you would have export performance which had moved in a European average way. I mean, everybody's exports has risen in some way. You would have been on the centre. And what you can see is that these countries in particular difficulty, Italy, Portugal, Spain and Greece, have all seen their competitiveness deteriorate because they're above this line, and they've all seen their export performance deteriorate as well, and they're to the left of that line. And Germany and only Austria are in this bottom right-hand corner. Ireland in an unusual position, I think, in the top right-hand corner, because Ireland attracted a huge amount of foreign direct investment, particularly from the US. So its export performance improved, and also Ireland had very low wage rates at the beginning of this and caught up. But Ireland, of course, is now in a serious problem as well. So you can see from this chart that declining competitiveness and poor export performance go hand in hand. In the case of Greece, you'll see competitiveness on this measure has only declined by 5% or so. And arguably, the Greek problem is largely a fiscal issue. As we've seen, the Greeks had budgets that were out of control. But in the case of Spain, Italy, and Portugal, the position is really rather different. In an interesting Bruegel policy paper recently, Marcinotto, Pisani-Ferri, and Andres Sapir point out that there are really significant differences between Greece and Spain. And in a paper they produced called Two Crises, Two Responses, from which this slide is drawn, argues that Spain's problem originated in a domestic credit boom and also in sclerotic labor markets. So while it was assumed when the euro was constructed that the main threats would come from undisciplined fiscal policy, to which there was a Stability and Growth Pact response, we can see that there are other big issues too, because Spain could well have remained in compliance with the Stability and Growth Pact, but still had a major competitiveness problem. Now, what is the answer to that, apart from exhortation? Well, Issing's view is that the solution lies in creating the necessary flexibility in markets, above all, the labour market. The theory may be correct, but there's so far been little sign that Spain is prepared to follow that prescription. So what does the EU do in response, apart from hoping and praying? Well, Sebastian Dullien and Daniela Schwarzer believe that excessive external imbalances also impose a serious danger to the stability of EMU, and think these deficits also need to be monitored at the European level. When the EMU was constructed, it was generally assumed that the only deficit that then mattered was the external deficit of the euro area as a whole. Dullien and Schwarzer argue that it's not correct, and that EMU needs an external stability pact to complement the existing agreements. On this analysis, there should be agreed thresholds for external balances. So, for example, the pact could stipulate that no Eurozone country may have a current account imbalance of more than 3% of GDP, either as a deficit or as a surplus, and exceeding either threshold would initially result in a warning, followed by appropriate measures to bring the imbalance down. Now, I can understand the logic behind this, and a similar argument, though one which doesn't quite reach the same conclusion, has been advanced by Danielle Gros and Thomas Mayer. They point out that the vulnerability of different euro area countries can come from different sources, and one of those will be the external balance, in particular what they describe as the need for external finance and the competitive position as an indicator of the ability to service external debt. So they have devised a rather interesting euro area vulnerability index, and this, you can see that the Greeks are at the top of it, largely driven, in their case, for their composition of this vulnerability index is largely driven by the fiscal position. But Portugal, second in this inverted league table, finds itself vulnerable largely because of its current account and net national savings position. So external balances on this argument and competitiveness are significant indicators. But I have to wonder whether an external stability pact is feasible. I ask, is Germany ready to be told by the European Commission to reduce its trade surplus? I mean, German politicians reacted rather sharply to suggestions along these lines from Christine Lagarde of France recently. But more importantly, is this not rather a heavy-handed attempt to manipulate the location of real economic activity across Europe? Within an economic area as diverse as the EMU, there will be significant changes in relative competitiveness, and I can't see that the Commission is powerful enough to resist them. That said, one crucial lesson of the last decade is that the countries who see a continued, relentless decline in their competitiveness will pay a price one day. And it seems to me it is for national governments, in my view, to respond, although the Commission and perhaps the ECB could be more forthright and outspoken in their commentary on these trends. And indeed, one reason, I think, for this particular crisis is the failure of the so-called Lisbon agenda to make Europe the most competitive economy in the world. That has simply not happened in large parts of Europe, and we're now paying the price for it. So while the focus of this last weekend was perhaps necessarily on fiscal problems and a package of support, a stabilization package, it's arguable that for some of these countries that is not the fundamental problem at all, and that there is a major competitiveness issue which has to be dealt with, or they will remain in this vulnerable state. Now, the third area is what I call the European Monetary Fund. Well, not me, but other people have called it that. And some people have argued, Grow and Mayer, whom I referred to, for a European Monetary Fund, and their views were echoed in an article in the Financial Times by Wolfgang Schäuble called Why Europe's Monetary Union Faces Its Biggest Crisis in February. And Schäuble's argument was that emergency liquidity assistance might be made available from a European Monetary Fund in the case of emergencies that present a threat to the financial stability of the whole euro area. Now, the academics argue the case slightly differently. They note that when imbalances, whether fiscal or external, arise, countries may well need to undergo painful adjustments if their public debt position is to become sustainable. But given the intense pressures from financial markets, and we've seen a vivid illustration of that recently, they say it's likely that in some cases a tough fiscal adjustment program might not be enough to avoid a sudden stop of necessary external funding of the public sector. And this, in a paper written a few months ago, is a very good description of what has happened. It came to the point where it didn't matter what the Greek government said about its determination to resolve its fiscal problem. The market wasn't interested and wasn't prepared to lend to them anyway. And that's what happened to Greeks a couple of weeks ago. Then they discussed whether it should be for the EU or the IMF to handle the problem, and that discussion clearly went on in a somewhat dysfunctional way within the chancelleries of Europe over the winter. Grow and Mayer describe the dilemma well and think it could be avoided by creating a European monetary fund. They acknowledge that some may object on the grounds that it violates the no bailout provision of the Maastricht Treaty, but in fact, they say, we would argue that our proposal is actually the only way to make the no bailout rule credible. Now, Willem Buiter, who was formerly, until just the other day, at the LSE and is now the chief economist of Citigroup, has sketched out some more details of how a European monetary fund might be set up. In his view, it would not require a treaty amendment and could be set up under the enhanced cooperation provisions of the Lisbon Treaty. Subscriptions would be in proportion to euro area countries' equity stake in the ECB. You'd have to, on his analysis, commit a really large amount of money, a couple of trillion euros, although the amount paid in could be less than that. And the board would be of euro area member states, the ECB, etc. And on this, if you look at the key, you'd be in for 27.1% because Germany has 27.1% of the ECB. Now, have we now got this as a result of the decisions this weekend? Have we, in effect, created a European monetary fund? Well, not really. The stabilization fund that was created is, in fact, a special purpose vehicle. I think it's slightly odd that they should have used this terminology of a special purpose vehicle, since it, on the whole, doesn't go down terribly well in financial markets these days. But that's what it is. It is a time-limited, 3-year-long SPV with a particular amount of money to resolve particular problems. So it could be the kernel of a European monetary fund, and my suspicion is that may be what it turns out to be. But for the moment, all we have is a smaller and time-limited stabilization fund in partnership with the IMF. There is another proposal in this area which has also been debated recently, which is that the euro area should issue bonds backed by all its governments. And of course, there is some element of that in what has been agreed over the weekend. Jacques Delplat and Jacob von Weizsäcker from the Bruegel Institute issued a paper last week proposing an ingenious scheme whereby EU countries might pool their obligations and issue so-called blue bonds, which would be collectively backed. And each member would be entitled to issue blue bonds up to the value of 60% of GDP. But if they wished to borrow more, they would issue red bonds, which would be junior, nationally backed debt. So up to the old Stability and Growth Pact ceiling, there would be a sort of collective backing of debt, but above that, you're on your own. I say this is ingenious, but I think it may be too ingenious for its own good. I'm not sure that it would be likely to reduce overall borrowing costs, as the authors suggest, because I think the red bonds would be priced in a very aggressive way. Well, the yields would be very aggressive, I should say. Also, different countries are in different historical debt positions. Then, of course, there is the political difficulty of persuading taxpayers to back bonds in other countries. So although this is ingenious, I doubt if it will find favor. Although, of course, if you could get back to some nirvana of a Stability and Growth Pact, which everybody was actually meeting, then it would be quite an interesting tool to keep people's feet to the fire. Because it would say, fine, you can borrow, and we will all collectively back that up to your limit. Beyond that, it's entirely up to you, which would reimpose a degree of market discipline, which arguably is what has been lacking in the last few years. But there are other areas too where it may be that enhanced European machinery is necessary. And that, I think, is particularly true in relation to the financial system. Because the broader financial crisis has demonstrated weaknesses in the way Europe's single financial market operates, weaknesses which need attention. And here we are talking about issues which can affect the UK directly, since we're part of the single financial market, although the arguments are particularly strong in the Eurozone. These arguments may be perhaps a bit less urgent than the problems dealt with over the weekend, but we know that the fiscal problems, if not dealt with, can easily bounce back into the banks. There is, I would say, still a reasonable possibility that Greece will, in spite of what's been agreed over the weekend, be obliged to restructure its debt at some point. I think that cannot be ruled out, and we know that that would, if there were a 30% haircut imposed on all Greek bonds, this would be very costly for the German and the French banking systems in particular. So we do have to think about how we deal with European banks in trouble, particularly pan-European banks. And so my fourth area is about financial regulation. Now, the Icelandic banking problem, and let's for the moment go to Iceland and leave the poor old Greeks alone for a while. The Icelandic banking problem demonstrated a flaw at the heart of the single financial market. Icelandic banks were supervised by the Icelandic authorities, and so I should emphasize it's the European Economic Area that's the relevant thing here, rather than the Eurozone or the EU, because it's the EEA to which the rules of the single market apply. So their banks used the provisions of the single market to establish branches and take deposits in other member states, backed by their own authorities. And they could do so without any involvement of the local regulators. So the FSA had no power at all over Kaupthing Bank offering very competitive deposits to British savers. And when those branches collapsed, it became clear that the Icelandic authorities were effectively unable to back them, and taxpayers in the Netherlands and in the UK had to step in at some considerable cost. In fact, the eventual cost-sharing arrangements between the host countries and Iceland have yet to be resolved, and of course have become matters of high politics. But I don't want to get into the details of the Icelandic problem. But the essence is, can we possibly allow a situation where you can have banks establishing branches on every street corner in your country, but backed by an authority which actually, when it comes to it, simply has not got the taxing power to back those liabilities? Now, this problem and others were put in the hands of Jacques de Larosière, always a good place to go when you have an intractable issue to resolve. And de Larosière produced a report which made a number of recommendations, most of them which have been broadly accepted by the Council of Ministers, although with some reluctance in the UK. And he recommended a new European Financial Stability Board, chaired by the President of the ECB, which should map quite well, in fact it's now called a European Systemic Risk Council, which will feed quite well into the Global Financial Stability Board. And he also recommended that the old committees of regulators which exist at the moment, the Committee of Banking Supervisors and the Committee of European Securities Regulators, etc., should become authorities with their own staff and all that. But these authorities would be set up within the existing legal framework, and indeed you may argue that they're hardly authorities in the proper sense of the term. Because the idea was to say, well, in future, you'd have a European banking authority who could make sure that you didn't have this cross-border problem. But in fact, although they're called authorities, there has not been a treaty change to establish them with any real powers over national regulators. And of course, as we know, there is not much appetite for new constitutional measures in Europe, given the difficulty of getting the Lisbon Treaty through. So this is the best that can be done in present circumstances, with these authorities effectively just renamed committees using the authorities only of the national regulators. Now, is this enough? Well, my own answer is no, and that in due course, and indeed pretty soon, we really ought to be moving to a more centralized European regulatory system with a European financial authority of some kind to oversee and stand behind pan-European banks in particular. This is an argument which Deutsche Bank has been putting for some time. I didn't used to agree with them, but now I do. But how effective would that regulator be if it wasn't linked to any mechanism to recapitalize or provide financial support to banks in difficulty? Here again, the Greek case is relevant. It's clear that at present, Greek banks can only get funding from the ECB. There is no other source of funding for them. And if there were to be any kind of haircut on Greek debt, an outcome which we can't exclude, they may well find themselves insolvent. So for that reason, Bauta argues that in addition to the European Monetary Fund, we need central funds to recapitalize systemically important cross-border financial institutions, either to allow them to continue operating or to wind up or liquidate them without unnecessary social costs. And he calls this a financial institution recapitalization fund. And it's not the ECB because it effectively has a call on taxpayers, which the ECB does not. And he thinks also that the European Monetary Fund and the Financial Institution Recapitalization Fund could be separate or could be merged, but that this is the minimum fiscal Europe, as he puts it, which is politically and economically necessary. In fact, the Bruegel Group in Brussels have proposed something quite similar. They've called it a European Resolution Fund, which would be on the model of the authority which is currently under discussion in the US in the Financial Regulatory Reform Bill in Congress, which would allow the US authorities to take over a failing institution and manage its liquidation. But this idea, of course, raises very significant political questions. It opens up the possibility that taxpayers in country A are supporting banks in country B. And unfortunately, as we know, however many devices I use and say country A and country B, we know that country A is Germany. And so it is particularly difficult here. But perhaps in the unusual circumstances we're living through, that is a better option than any of the available alternatives. Certainly, there's a strong collective interest in Europe in maintaining the integrity of economic and monetary union, and that may be the price that has to be paid. In other words, I think some kind of European resolution authority ought also to be on the Council of Ministers' agenda. I think it would be quite surprising if we got through this whole fiscal crisis in Europe without some European banks getting into serious trouble and cross-Europe, pan-European banks getting into trouble, and having no mechanism to resolve that is difficult. Mervyn King, Governor of the Bank of England, said recently, the problem is that banks, big international institutions, are global in life, but national in death. and that is currently accurate. And can we allow that in Europe? Well, my view is we've got two directions we can go. We can have more Europe or we can have less Europe in financial markets. In other words, we can either have Central European mechanisms to regulate the European financial market and a resolution authority to help resolve the problems of pan-European institutions, or we disintegrate the single financial market, by which I mean banks would then be required to establish separately capitalized subsidiaries everywhere they go. So the Icelandic banks would say, absolutely fine, you can come, but in the UK, you will have separate capital, ring-fenced in the UK, looked after by the Financial Services Authority. My own view is, at the moment, we're in no man's land. We have to go in one direction or the other. So that's competitiveness, fiscal discipline, competitiveness, European Monetary Fund, financial regulation. But what about the most difficult issue of fiscal transfers? Because some would argue that even if you did all this, that it's not enough, and that the real lesson of the crisis is that Europe needs a much more centralized fiscal policy. How powerful is that argument? Well, you may have seen in today's Financial Times, Wolfgang Munchau said that we need a minimally sufficient fiscal union, defined, in his view, as 5% of EU GDP managed at the centre. Without that, he says, the proposed reforms are likely to fail. Well, the idea that a single currency would need a coordinated fiscal policy is not a new one. Indeed, the McDougall report in 1977 argued that in the context of a monetary union, a budget of up to 25% of EU GDP would be needed at the centre to cope with stabilisation and to offset economic differentials between countries. But in the intervening 30 years, there's been little appetite for a move in that direction, and the EU budget remains at 1.5% of GDP. Now, some economists have continued to argue that if autonomy over monetary policy is conceded to a central institution, alternative adjustment mechanisms to cope with asymmetric shocks are necessary. And the experience of the first decade of monetary union has shown that the alternative of greater economic flexibility has not been working effectively. As we've seen, wage flexibility in Germany has delivered changes in relative hourly labour cost and competitiveness, which are an important reason, or changes in relative unit labour costs, an important reason for the problems we've now got. And so this has led some people to say you've got to have more central fiscal policy. And one proposition is there should be some degree of basic unemployment insurance funded at European level, which would assist the adjustment mechanisms of countries whose competitiveness has declined, as in Spain, and where unemployment is very high. Spanish unemployment is now over 20% and putting enormous pressure on domestic budgets. And there are arguments, too, for more centralized corporation taxes. Ising strongly disagrees with all of this. In his view, as we've heard, Stability and Growth Pact is all you need. And it's perhaps the existence of these grander schemes of European fiscal integration which creates suspicion of the motives of those who argue for some form of European economic governance. After all, it's very clear in which direction these fiscal transfers would go. From here, they would travel southwest and southeast, and the Alps would be an ineffective barrier. So for the moment, I regard these as ideas in the realm of theory, not practice. But they are canvassed in an interesting way in a forthcoming paper by Dullian and Schwarzer called Bringing Macroeconomics into the EU Budget Debate, and they can't be dismissed entirely. But finally, there is another possible agenda of change which may emerge on the horizon. We hear less of it in Germany and almost nothing in the UK, but there are those in France particularly who are concerned about the structure of the ECB, its independence, accountability, decision-making, and all of that. Sarkozy has regularly criticized it for taking too rigorous a line, and I think these debates may achieve greater prominence as the question of the succession to Jean-Claude Trichet in Frankfurt begins to be discussed. Trichet steps down at the end of his unrepeatable 8-year term during 2011. And there's been a lot of pressure, political pressure, on ECB in recent weeks. People wanted it to intervene in the bond markets, which finally, yesterday, they have agreed. And they've agreed now to buy government bonds over the dead body, so to speak, of Jürgen Stark, who has said he would never do such a thing. But there's another reason why this question of the structure of the ECB might arise. For the moment, the possibility of rising European interest rates seems very remote. The whole of European economy seems in a delicate condition. But it's quite evident that the prospects for the next 2 or 3 years are very different in different countries. Greece is likely to remain in recession for the next 2 years if the required budget adjustment process is carried forward. Even on the most optimistic projections, they will be in some form of recession. Prospects for Spain and Portugal, if they have a big fiscal adjustment, look pretty ropey as well, while some northern members may well recover more quickly. Setting the monetary dial for a single currency in these circumstances is going to be very difficult, and you can't duck it. There can only be one short-term interest rate in a monetary union. It will be essential for the ECB to maintain its independence and legitimacy in the face of inevitable protests from one group of countries or another. And the controversy that the ECB has experienced in the last 2 or 3 months will be as nothing to what it experiences if it's tightening interest rates while Greece, Spain, Italy and Portugal are all still in recession. By international standards, the ECB is a highly independent institution. Now, there are various competing measures of independence in the academic literature, but in all of them, the ECB is the most independent and the Bank of Japan the least. The ECB has a price stability mandate in the treaty and is able to define it itself, whereas the Bank of England has a target set by the government, which can in principle be changed by politicians, while the Fed also has the obligation to aim at maintaining maximum employment. So the Fed has this more balanced objective, which Congress rather likes. The ECB can ignore employment if it wishes and can take no instructions from the Council of Ministers. The ECB is also much less accountable than other central banks. Sorry, this is a rather busy slide, but this is a paper which assesses accountability of central banks on various measures, the extent to which they have to appear before Parliament, the extent to which they is the head of the central bank voted on by Parliament, what is the length of his term, her term, etc. And then independence, to what extent can they make their decisions. And the ECB is right out here, is the most independent central bank in the world and the least accountable central bank in the world. And these characteristics stem from its Bundesbank ancestry on the one hand, and on the other, the unusual political framework within which it operates. Because as Strauss-Kahn points out, there is no finance minister to act as interlocutor. And the European Parliament is a far weaker legislator than the US Congress. So it's quite clear that when Bernanke is hauled in front of the Senate Banking Committee, this is a different character of experience from Jean-Claude Trichet appearing in front of the European Monetary Affairs Committee in Brussels. I imagine probably all of you in here could name some members of the Senate Banking Committee, and maybe 1 or 2 of you could name some members of the European Monetary Affairs Committee in Brussels, but I wouldn't put too much money on it. So this is partly just because of the single monetary union, doesn't have the kind of interlocutor. And there is another unusual feature of the ECB. It is very high on an index of what we might call unrepresentativeness. Now, one feature of that is obvious. The ECB was set up as a one vote per country system. And if you look on the left-hand side, this is is a paper 3 years ago. So it was when there was an EMU 12 with one country, one vote, and Germany has, 5% of the votes and 30% of the GDP. And on a hypothetical EMU 24, Germany has effectively 6% of the vote and 22% of GDP. And as you can see, apart from Italy, Spain, and France, everybody else is significantly overrepresented. And that is even if you follow the ECB's rotation ideas, because they have actually produced some ideas whereby as the number of countries expand, which of course may not happen quite so quickly as we thought, that sometimes the smaller countries would not actually be voting members. There is an alternative, more sophisticated construction, which looks at the balance between the centre and the regions. And I think this will be especially significant in a situation in which there are major differences in growth performance from one part of Europe to another. In Europe, the ratio of regional votes to central votes is much larger than it is in the Federal Reserve system. And what this shows is the ratio of regional to central votes. In other words, there are members of the ECB Directorate, and there are 6 of them, and then, of course, there are the governors of the national central banks, and they all have a vote on interest rates in the governing council. And there are 2.5 times as many regional votes as there are central votes. In other words, people who are looking at their country's position as opposed to people who are looking at the Eurozone as a whole. In the Fed, it's 0.7 to 1, because in the Fed there are governors who are required to take a US-wide view, and then there are the presidents of some of the regional Feds, but only a few of them are allowed to vote, and the voting is rotated, in order deliberately to maintain a strong central view of monetary conditions for the US as a whole, and not to get dragged about by the problems of particular areas. In the Bundesbank, it was 1.1 to 1 in the old days, so much closer to the Fed than to the ECB. And this ratio would, of course, become even more marked with new members, and the rotation ideas would only have a modest impact on it. And there's a further point to note about the ECB. Its decision-making processes are far less transparent than those of the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England. Both of them have voting procedures, somewhat different in each case, which highlight the balance of views. The minutes of their meetings are published with a delay, and indeed individual votes identified in the UK, and now increasingly actually in the Fed as well. We know much less about the balance of views in the Governing Council. Now, this is complicated territory, and I explore the arguments in this book in some depth. And all these features of the ECB are strengths in one way, but in difficult economic circumstances, the risk is that they become weaknesses and attract political criticism. And our conclusions are that it's important to strengthen the accountability mechanisms of the ECB. Its processes should become more transparent, and the misrepresentation index should at the very least not be allowed to increase. And we say this not because we want to diminish ECB independence, but because we wish to preserve it. And we see a risk that in difficult times there will be pressure for more political control of the ECB, which is dangerous. And to head that off now, the ECB should be prepared to open up its processes to give more confidence to those affected by its decisions. We also note, of course, that if the ECB is doing things other than the short-term interest rate, like involvement in financial stability and regulatory matters, which is envisaged under the de la Rosière scheme, or indeed now effectively getting involved in fiscal decisions because of buying bonds from member states, different types of accountability are required for those functions, and that needs to be taken into account. So, to conclude, there is a lengthy agenda of change ahead in EMU if it's to be refurbished in the light of the experience of the first decade, and especially in the light of the current crisis. I don't know if this is quite what Almunia had in mind when he talked about unfinished business, but it's my own suggested menu. And I think overall we have to recognize that the early years of monetary union was relatively calm. As we say in Banking on the Future, in retrospect it can be seen that the euro's first decade was a propitious one for the launch of an untried experiment. It remains to be seen whether the euro area will remain as comfortable and the ECB's policies as well accepted with the ending of the period of unprecedented economic calm. And at the moment, I fear, there are signs that people still haven't understood the extent to which this has been a lucky period for monetary policy and the scale of the challenge ahead. Mervyn King in the UK used to refer to something called the nice decade, which was the non-inflationary, constantly expansionary decade. And the nice decade is over, and we are now in a pretty nasty decade, and where some of the certainties and comfortable ways of working that we used to have are not going to work. At a ceremony in Strasbourg in July of last year to celebrate the Euro's 10th birthday, Jean-Claude Trichet said, "The financial crisis is demonstrating that in turbulent financial waters, it is better to be on a large, solid and steady ship rather than on a small vessel." And he went on to say that together we have shown that Europe is capable of taking decisions even in the most difficult circumstances. Well, I am the proud owner of a small 30-foot elderly sailing boat, and I keep it in Greece, as it happens. And sometimes I'm tempted to think that it is rather safer than some of the huge ships I see in the Corfu Channel struggling to maneuver, and particularly this one. I was very proud that my assistant found this, because this ship, although you can't see it, amazingly, this ugly thing, is called the Club Med, which I couldn't have made up. But I don't mean to imply that I think that the Greeks would be better off relaunching the SS Drachma. But those on the bridge of the mothership Euro need to acknowledge that merely asserting the value of size and dwelling on past successes will not suffice. There is a big overhaul task ahead, or some of the passengers may well choose to man the lifeboats. And my aim this evening has been to suggest a few areas in which maintenance work is most needed. Thank you.